Welcome everybody. Thanks for having me for the 5th time. As she mentioned, we're going to be talking about building a software supply chain security team today. Can everybody hear me okay? I hate carrying a microphone. Okay, I'm really loud too. So, all right, agenda for today. You don't care about that. We're going to get right into it. So introduction, a little bit about me. Like I already said, I've been here 5 times before. Have spent the last 7, 8 something years of my career being an AppSec consultant, and have done what the consultants say going back to industry. Now I work for a cryptocurrency exchange where I've spent the last year building a supply chain security team from the ground up. I've been in IT something like 20 years, 10 years of that in AppSec, 20 plus years of development experience because I've done it since middle school, 7 years of consulting, a year in crypto, and a year in supply chain security. So buzzword bingo, I've been all over the place. Bit about me, I'm getting ready to celebrate my 20th wedding anniversary. Pretty excited about that. My kids are all getting older, beard's getting grayer. My oldest is about to go to college. I like to play guitar, hike, camp, board game, and video game. So why am I here today? I just originally got the idea for this talk just because my boss, the chief security officer of Bullish, is a previous consultant as well. And so we kind of had this big idea. If everybody's talking about SBOMs, we know supply chain security is going to just absolutely explode. But nobody's really doing anything about it. So how about we be one of the first, actually build a supply chain security team, take that consultant mindset, and try to do what we think is right. So point here, everybody's talking about supply chain security. I don't think anybody's doing a darn thing about it, and hopefully some of you all will disagree with that. So case in point, I went to RSA earlier this year. Every single block of talks that they had at RSA, there was a supply chain talk. Every single one of them. I checked on Monday, there were 29 presentations, which were almost as much as ransomware. And we know how many ransomware talks there are at RSA, pretty much all of them. A lot of them were talking about SBOMs, just like here, right? I counted 6 supply chain talks on the agenda this year for LastCon, up from, I think, 0 last year. So, getting a lot of attention. But at RSA, I attended every one of those talks. None of them talked about the how, right? They all talked about how cool SBOMs are and how everybody needs to do them and how Biden says you're going to have to. Not one of them told you how to generate an SBOM. And then most of the rest were talking about third-party risk management, and they were just trying to give it a sexy title, like supply chain security. So I need a lot of help with this. I'm building this from the ground up. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll go hit the vendor show floor at RSA, right? Like every security vendor known to man is there. 0 of them were focused on supply chain. There was not one supply chain or SBOM type of vendor out there. Not one vendor was even talking about SBOMs. The closest I could find was our SCA vendors doing the software composition analysis, which I'm sure many of you probably have experience with today. Feel free to challenge me. As far as I've seen, not one of them truly supports SBOMs. All of them generate an inventory report inside of their tool, and then they output that into an SBOM format that generally doesn't actually meet the specification of the SBOMs, but we'll talk about that more later. And so in the end, I couldn't find a single vendor that could help me solve any of my supply chain related problems. So pretty big gap there when we look at how much we're hearing about supply chain, SBOMs, whatever, and start looking for people to try to help us. All right, so as I mentioned, I've spent the last year building the supply chain security program. So when we first walked into this, we kind of had to decide, okay, well, what is supply chain security? Is it SBOMs? Is it a piece of the AppSec program? What does it really look like? And so we went in on day 1 and basically defined what we saw as supply chain security to start building our program around it. And this is basically it. This is really our pillars of supply chain security at the organization where I work. So on the left, we've got open source third-party libraries. This is everything you probably expect that this is, right? This is looking at all of our open source. It's looking at our package managers, how we bring the open source in, the software composition analysis tools, approval processes, artifact storage. Looking for log4shell, I've heard that 100 times today. Apache Commons last week, whatever one's going to come out today while I'm here probably, finding all of those. Our third-party software, right? Open source is a big piece of it, but there's also a lot of software that's closed source or that we purchase. So anytime something goes through our procurement process, that also comes to supply chain security. Now we're not doing GRC, we're not doing TPRM, we're doing third-party security assessments, things of that nature, making sure the software that people are trying to buy meets the security requirements to be within our organization. We look at all of our suppliers, right? So this is getting back to things like Target, right? Target was breached because an HVAC vendor was breached, and that HVAC vendor had access into the Target network. So what security controls do our suppliers have in place to prevent us from being breached as a result of their own misdoings? And then finally, my team's responsible for the security of our software factory. So really all of the tools that are used in the build and deploy processes for our source code. So that's everything from source code management to orchestration to artifact storage, CI, CD, all of that. We're in charge of the security of that. So we work really closely with our DevOps teams and make sure that we're hardening all of those systems so that way we don't become a SolarWinds. All right, so let's break that down a little bit further. I'm not going to read all of these bullet points. It's a lot of words, but you can read them while I talk. But if we take those pillars and we kind of break them down into what it is we actually do, right? So this is kind of going from the high level, here's the 4 key pillars of what makes up supply chain, to here is what my team does on a daily basis, right? So 1 is we maintain our internal software bill of materials. And here in a minute, we're going to talk about observations and lessons learned and things like that, and we'll talk about how much SBOMs actually suck. But we're responsible for generating and updating those SBOMs, and then also generating them for external distribution. So if somebody wants to come and use our crypto exchange and they say, hey, can you give us an SBOM? We can be one of the first companies in the world, it seems like, to say, here you go, here's our SBOM. We look at our dependencies for known vulnerabilities. So again, this is just software composition analysis. We're not reinventing the wheel or anything here, right? And one of the big observations that I'll talk about is this kind of gets back to the same AppSec messaging that we've been preaching for many, 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 many years, right? I think I talked last year about how much I hate shift left, and shift left really sucks, and we're doing it all wrong. I've kind of naively have thought that we've solve some problems, but really Jeff Williams is right. And we can't even really do software composition analysis good. And we're just missing a lot of just best practices, and the tools don't work as good as personally even years in AppSec I would have thought that they did. And then we work closely with our engineering teams for remediation. And we define leading practices for using software libraries, open source or otherwise. So I maintain a set of open source standards. So that way, anytime our developers want to use an open source library, there's a set of published standards that they have to follow that outline minimum criteria. Is it well maintained? Was there a known Russian hacker that contributed to the repo a year ago? Are there known vulnerabilities in it and things of that nature? In a lot of cases, we also create wrappers, so that way, if we don't need, say, a full open source package, we can just take the pieces that we need, fork it, throw some wrappers around it, and only expose the methods and things that we actually need to use, as opposed to using the entire library. All right, so on to the next pillar, maintain supplier software bill of materials. So how many of you ask your suppliers for an SBOM today? Nobody? Okay. That doesn't surprise me. I expected I'd get 1 or 2, but I have been asking my suppliers for SBOMs for over a year now. I have received, I think I say in the presentation, 0. I've actually received 1, and that's because I purchased a tool that I'd be happy to talk about, not in this talk, for SBOM governance and management, and that supplier did give me their SBOM. No other organization has. And this is everything from other crypto solutions, custodial solutions, technology companies. One of the biggest technology companies that everyone in here has heard of. It starts with an O and rhymes with some other words. Asked them for an SBOM and a threat model. And they actually told me that is proprietary. We will not give you an SBOM. We will never give you an SBOM. Don't ask us again. And this was after the executive order was published, right? So despite what many of us might think or what we're hearing in all of these talks, this is not getting adopted today. And I try to partner closely with our suppliers to maintain and get those SBOMs. So, when they don't give them to us, I try to work with them, try to help them generate them, try to educate them so that way they can meet our requirements. Because here in the very near future, it will be a requirement to actually partner with us as an organization. If you don't have an SBOM, you likely will not do business with us. And then develop leading practices and configuration for third-party vendor software and SaaS products. That's a mouthful. Basically, what that means is whenever we buy software or some solution, we try our best to harden it, and we document it. We create a wiki or whatever it might be. We take the configuration of that product, we harden it, we document all of the configuration settings, and then we monitor it. Right? So, regardless of whether that's a cloud provider or a plugin for Slack or whatever it may be, we monitor what those security configurations are. So that way, if somebody changes those configurations so that they're no longer best practice, we can identify who did that, when, and go back and make sure that it meets the configuration. One of our big initiatives for next year is to automate that, which kind of sounds like an impossible task right now. But we'll see how that goes, because today it's largely documentation based, but ideally there'd be some way for us to just scrape that configuration and then have some sort of job that monitors it and notifies us anytime there's a change. We define the ownership for all of our third-party stuff. So whenever, again, anything comes in, we don't do this for like every open source library, but if it was an open source product, so say RabbitMQ, right? Something big like that's a good example. Or anything that we procure, we require that a RACI chart gets created. So that way we have defined ownership for whatever that solution is, and we can go out into the organization whenever we have questions or something goes wrong or we need to integrate with another tool, and we have somebody who does own that. I feel like most companies do a pretty good job of doing that at a process level or for things that they create internal, but it's often an oversight for a third party. And then finally, getting into the software factory. So as I said earlier, we partner with our DevOps teams. We constantly look at our build and deploy technology stack and basically figure out how to secure it, right? Again, everybody's talking about supply chain attacks. SolarWinds is mentioned about twice in every single talk. But how do you actually harden your software factory, right? There's not really, at least that I've found, there's not a guide that you can just go out there and download, right? Go to GitHub and ask them for hardening guidelines for GitHub. Spoiler, they don't have one. So you kind of have to figure that out on your own. Actually, I just asked them on Monday. So they still don't have it. And so what a lot of people did, in my prior life is they would hire consultants like us to come out and take a look at their Jenkins or, whatever other horrible systems, because they all suck, to look at and ask us for guidance on how to harden them. And ultimately, we find all sorts of horrible things, right? You've got secrets stored in the system, and oh, hey, you can just output those in a job to a text file and get all the secrets out of your CI system. The developers can just delete their pipeline.yaml file and just bypass all of the security controls that you built into your CI system. The list goes on and on and on and on. So we do our best to review and document those configurations and make sure they're not bypassable. We implement security gates into the tool chain. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, over on container security. I won't talk about that one too much because my team doesn't care a whole lot about container security. That falls into more of our security engineering team at my org. But what I do care about is the open source packages that are in our containers. So we'll talk about that with the SBOMs too. But this kind of gets us to that next level of, I think it was somebody was saying earlier, it might have been Dan, right? Who cares about an open source vulnerability if you're not actually running it, not actually deploying it, right? If you're just scanning your open source, you're probably getting all of your developer dependencies in there. But also, what about your OS dependencies? So, what's your out there runtime deployed in a container or however you're deploying today? What about all of those Debian repos and packages and all of those type of things, right? Those are things we need visibility into as well. So really, right, it's more than just SBOMs, right? This is an entire program. So I want to talk a little bit about where we started, and then we'll kind of circle back and I'll share a lot of just lessons learned and challenges, and really this probably paints a pretty rosy picture so far. I'm going to destroy that rosy picture here in a minute. So our team size, so again, we're a supply chain security team, right? It's not some poor person on the AppSec team that we said we need to do SBOMs now, and so now we have this guy sitting in the corner where 10% of his time is dedicated to supply chain security or something like that. Right, and I think that was in Dan's talk earlier, right? It was something, 5 to 10% of AppSec budgets is going to be going towards supply chain. Why does it need to be the AppSec budget, right? Why shouldn't it be the cybersecurity budget? And that's exactly the approach that we've taken. So in our case, being a crypto exchange, right? We follow the sun in our operating model. So we've got 24-hour support. So my supply chain team is 3 of us. So I'm in the US and I lead the team. And then I have 2 team members that are based in Singapore. Again, providing 24-hour support. And we have room to grow, right? With all of these responsibilities, I could double the size of my team and we would still have work to do, right? So, if you're trying to tackle all of this, again, with some person on your AppSec team that's spending 5% on this, you're probably not going to get very far. We've been doing this a bit over a year at this point, and our team is actually a split off from the GRC team. So mid last year, the GRC lead left our organization, and our CISO made the decision that would be a really good time to actually split the org. And so what he did was, instead of just hiring a new GRC lead, he spun off a separate GRC team and a supply chain security team. And then that's when he hired me to kind of come in and figure out how to solve that problem. But we started off with not even really SBOMs, right? We started off with third-party security assessments. So taking a look at our third parties and the things that are coming in through procurement or other policy exceptions, and doing security reviews on them, right? So things like, do you just let anybody install whatever browser extension they want, right? Most places probably do. People can just freely download browser extensions. What about Slack plugins? Right? We talk about a lot of really, really, really important things in Slack. Right? But then we just take a plugin and we throw it in there, and that can be sending. Actually, most of those Slack plugins will provide read-only access to your messages to whomever is providing that plugin for you. Right? Are you taking a look at those? Even if it's something open source, are you reviewing the open source code and checking for any sort of data exfiltration, any data leaving your organization and going out to who knows where? And none of that's even touching the things that we're actually buying and doing security assessments of. The configuration reviews was another easy one, right? We're cloud first, so we use a lot of cloud solutions. So making sure all of those have all of the appropriate security controls in place, working with the team, partnering with the teams as they're implementing those solutions. And, instead of just saying, okay, cool, it's a cloud solution, you're approved and you can buy it and you're good now, right? We continue working with them from that point on to document the configuration, make sure they're setting up users right, that they don't have 100,000 admins that can do anything, that we're not turning on silly options like allow the vendor access into that particular product. Things like that. Establish the open source program. We defined the program roadmap. And then we redefined it, we redefined it, we redefined it. Because, again, we're making this up as we go. And at this point, I've probably redefined what the supply chain security team looks like about 4 times now. For, again, reasons we'll talk about in a minute. And I've also done a lot of speaking with industry analysts, which has yielded some interesting results. All right, so let's talk about my key observations. And this is where we start getting a little bit sadder. So all everybody talks about is SBOMs, right? I think I've said that a few times now. What nobody has probably told you, unless you've tried this on your own, is SBOMs are really freaking hard. How many of you have tried to generate an SBOM before? A few hands. Was it easy? Was it just for a single repo, or share some thoughts with me?
At what level are you talking about an SBOM? At the file level, before it's compiled, or after it's compiled, just the libraries?
That's my second point. So it's a valid question. Pick your favorite.
I've done files right out of version control.
Okay.
It's not easy, you're right.
Okay. Anybody else? Good.
I work for Contrast. And,
Okay.
I'm a professional services solutions engineer. So I use our own tool, our SCA tool. Of course, I have a license for it, which gives me the ability to generate SBOMs from an application. And it does use the Wallace standard, Cyclone DX, whatever it is.
Okay. All right. Okay. Cool. I come from aspect security, so I spent many years working with Jeff. So I share some of his thoughts and disagree with him on others. So some of my thoughts here are, as I mentioned at RSA, there are basically 0 tools to help you with this problem, right? If you go out and you say, well, for one, you got to figure out what specification you want to follow first, right? Everybody in this room is probably going to tell you Cyclone DX. But then everybody's also going to tell you about dependency track. What they also don't tell you is that a lot of the tools out there will only generate SPDX. So like some of your software composition analysis vendors will only do SPDX. And that was intentionally removed from dependency track several versions ago. So if you want to use dependency track, well, you better make sure that if your vendors do start actually ever giving you SBOMs, that they give you a Cyclone DX and that it conforms to the specification. If you go out to the Cyclone DX website, it gives you probably about 100 different open source tools that are in various states of maintainability to generate these for you. And then you got to figure it out from there, right? I generate code in multiple tech stacks, right? We've got Gradle, we've got NPM, we've got Java, we've got JavaScript. Well, if you look at Cyclone DX, each one of those is like a different tool. And then you got to figure out how to plug them in. Most of them want you to put that into the source code repository, right? Well, what if my developers go in there and just delete that item out of the build Gradle or something like that, and all of a sudden I'm not getting an SBOM, right? It's really, really difficult to generate an end-to-end SBOM. So, and from my perspective, my final product, right, it's a crypto exchange. It's very, very modern. We don't have mono repos and things like that, right? We're deploying containers to Kubernetes. So I've got about 60 containers that are deploying on a release. Some number of VMs, HSMs and things like that, because we're a crypto company. I've got blockchain architecture. I've got smart contracts and C++ code. So even though I might be able to get a tool, or maybe Contrast, I'll pick on Contrast for a second, might be able to scan a repo and give me that output. But how do I get it to give it to me for 60 containers and 10 VMs and then 20 repos that get deployed in some other way? And then how do I put all of that together into one? Because if somebody comes to me and says, give me your SBOM, I can't give them 100 different SBOMs. I got to give them one, right? So how do I get all of that into one? That's a really difficult problem. There's no best practices yet on where to generate them. It's just like you said, right? Do we generate them out of the containers? Do we get it out of the code? Do we get it out of the build system? Where do we get it from? Where do we start, right? CISA, I think, will tell you probably all 3 of those. But you've got to start somewhere. And in my case, where I started was with the containers, honestly, because I care about what's running. And so, what I do is actually part of our deployment process. I actually pull all of the containers out of our Kubernetes cluster that are running in our test environment during the deploy. And then I run some one open source tool on them to generate the output. And then I actually take that and I send that off to another tool for the governance and management. And then that way I get what's actually running. I don't have to worry about developer dependencies. I get all of the OS runtime dependencies and all of that good stuff too. Tooling is nascent and immature. Again, if you're a vendor, this is a completely empty space that's just rife with opportunity. Right? If you can figure out how to make a solution that will generate SBOMs for people and give them an end-to-end holistic SBOM and do it for all tech stacks, everybody's going to need your tool within the next year. So you give me some royalties. The tools that we do have today, most of them don't conform to specifications. Cyclone DX is not a tool, right? I've had multiple software composition analysis vendors tell me that Cyclone DX is a tool, right? It's a specification. It's a document format, basically, at the end of the day. The same is true of SPDX and the other common formats for SBOMs. So when you do start thinking about these other tools, like if you can generate an SBOM, where are you going to put it? Right? That's another problem. There are a couple tools in that space that are actually pretty decent. But your SBOM typically has to conform to the specification because it has to validate before it will upload. If you go to Cyclone DX, for example, they have a validator on their website. You can take the file, you can put it through that validator, and it will say this is a valid SBOM or it is not. All of those tools that I have used generate an invalid SBOM, right? So that's another problem. So they have to conform to the specification. We've got few tools for governance and management, right? So I've asked this actually I did ask this to all of the software composition analysis vendors at RSA. So for one, their tools, this is my wording, don't do SBOMs, right? They say they do. Really what they do is they generate an inventory report inside of the solution. Then most of them have written some hack job Python or whatever that you go download and run. And then it basically takes that inventory report and it outputs it as an SBOM that doesn't conform to the specifications. And then we're back to that problem, right? But then where do you put it? Right? If I ask you where you're going to put your SBOM, I get a lot of answers like, oh, I'll just stick it in the source code repository, or I'll dump it in the container, or whatever. That's fine. That's not a problem, other than to Dan's point earlier, right? You really need a system to be able to visualize those. If you're not looking at the data, an SBOM does nothing, right? If you're not comparing it to vulnerability data or whatnot. But what about as soon as one of your suppliers gives you an SBOM? Where are you going to put that? Are you just going to have like a random Git repo that has a bunch of SBOMs in it, right? We need a solution of where to put those. And then again, good luck getting an SBOM from a supplier. I've been trying for a year, and we'll hopefully be getting more in the near future, but nobody's doing this today. All right, are we on time? All right, we'll speed up a little bit. So this is a software composition analysis problem here, right? But in my experience, again, when I came into this position, I was coming at it more from, I've been consulting in AppSec for many years. And I was kind of under this impression that we've solved this open source analysis problem. And I was really surprised by how much it sucks. It's not an easy thing to do. And just figuring out how to integrate the tools, how to scan, how to get consistent results, right? I started this position November 22nd of last year, right before Thanksgiving, right? Within 2 weeks was Log4j. So, I had to take, actually what happened was the Log4j came in, it was like 2 in the morning or something in the US, right? So what happened is, a team over in Asia took a look at it. They went into our software composition analysis tool and they said, oh, well, we don't see any Log4j. We're good, we're done, right? And then I came in the morning and I'm like, holy shit, we have Log4j everywhere. Why did you all say we don't, right? So you got to use the tools to get value out of them, right? And then it's the same problem. Where do you scan? How do you scan? How do you get the results? Do you do it in a pipeline? Do you manually scan? Do you do the containers? Personally, the most value I've received has been just doing it directly in GitHub. So I've got my tooling now. It took me 9 months to get it there, and I'm actually still having problems. But basically, it's integrated into GitHub, and now it scans on every single commit. And we get about 95% coverages that way. A lot of people argue for pipeline scans. Honestly, I have found that having it integrated into GitHub, I really don't need to do the pipeline scan, because most of the pipeline scans just go out to your repo, they do a clone, and then they scan it and do all their analysis. Well, I'm already doing that in GitHub. Why do I need to do it a second time? Right? Like, let's just call the API and see the results and not waste time with 15 more minutes of scanning, because pipelines are cool. You got to layer this with other tools, right? So when Log4j first hit, it took me about 4 to 5 days to identify everywhere in our internal code where we had Log4j, right? I'm in a crypto startup. I don't have decades of source code and thousands of products, right? We really have one product and about 1,500 or so code repositories that are split up. So I'm kind of playing the game on easy mode. And even then, it still took me 4 to 5 days to figure out where we had Log4j. And that's not even talking to my suppliers and figuring out where they have Log4j, which was another problem. Last week for Apache Commons, I did all of that in an hour. I was able to find everywhere in our organization where we had Apache Commons text, if we were affected and if we were calling the code, right? And I was able to do that really with a combination of our open source tooling, which is now integrated into GitHub and getting scans on every commit, right? But I still don't trust that. I've been in AppSec a while. Our data sucks and our reports suck, right? So if it tells me I have it in these 5 places, I don't trust that, right? I do more analysis. GitHub code search is great, right? cs.github.com. If you haven't signed up for it, it's a kind of an experimental feature that you have to click a button and say, please give it to me. Go do it. It's awesome. It basically takes the code searching that you can do on GitHub and makes it great and easy, and you can do a lot of just complicated searches and get instant results. And then SBOMs, right? So at this point, I have SBOMs from all of my containers. So I was able to go in, look at my SBOMs, look at my open source analysis results, and then look at GitHub code search. And now all 3 of those tools gave me the same results. Now I trust that data, right? Those are probably the only places where we have Log4j or whatever it may be. I've had a lot of challenges with tech stacks, right? It's another age-old AppSec problem, right? Tools do pretty good with old school Java and .NET or whatever, but you throw anything more modern into the mix and most of the tools start falling on their faces. And what I have found is Gradle is a huge problem with this tooling. If my developers do anything even slightly non-standard with Gradle, my open source scans will start to fail. And the problem is, if you're not paying attention, you just lose visibility and results. So, I have one package in particular that's a problem child. It has something like 1,700 open source libraries in it, including the transitives. When the scan fails, the tool doesn't tell you the scan failed, right? It says the scan was successful, but that it only found 2 libraries. So if you're not paying attention, it looks like you fixed a bunch of things or whatever. It gets lost in the noise, right? So you got to really pay attention to those things. And vulnerability management's lacking or non-existent, right? So especially for those of you who might use SAST and these other tools and you're used to having some sort of a triage workflow that makes you drink at night or whatever, it's even worse when you get into open source, because the issue either exists or it doesn't. There's no way to say, hide this issue in a lot of these tools, or it's not exploitable, or I'm looking at it and mark it as in progress or something like that, right? It's there or it's not. That's it. All right, 3, few security leading practices exist for securing the software factory. Again, I thought this would be pretty easy. It's not. Right, I've asked my vendors how to harden their systems to provide me with guidelines, things like that. There are no leading practices that I have found that tell you how to take your software factory and how to lock it down. So either pay a consultant, to come in and tell you all the many ways that they can hack your factory, and believe me, there's a lot of them, or figure it out yourself. But it's a lot of work. Personal access tokens are your worst enemy. How many people in here are developers? Quite a few. So you probably all have a personal access token, for your source code management or whatever, right? So if you're not familiar, basically, probably about any tool in your software factory, you need to be able to communicate with it, right? You need to make a git push to push your source code up, or you need to create a pull request, or you need to pull a container from your artifact repository or something of that nature, right? Nobody uses the GUI, right? Nobody goes to, your GitHub instance and clicks buttons, right? You open up the command line and you configure your authentication in the command line, to talk to the service, and then, right, you integrate with your IDEs or whatever. All of these tools do that with a personal access token. Right? So like GitHub, for example, you go into the developer tools, you log in, and then you say generate a personal access token, and I want it to have these permissions, and we're lazy, so we all give it the same permissions that we have, and hopefully we're not an admin. And then it says we're only going to show you this token once, so store it somewhere, and you put it inside of your secret vault, hopefully, and not on a notepad. And then you just go about your day, right? And that's how we generally configure service accounts and things like that too. Well, guess what? If somebody gets a hold of one of these accounts, they're authenticated into these services. So whether it's your source code management or your artifact repository or your CI system, whatever it may be, right? And hopefully many of you have observed this too. If you're communicating to these systems through the API or a CLI, you're not logging in with usernames and passwords and MFA or SSO, all that, right? You're giving it effectively an API token. That's your authentication. So if one of these gets leaked out, that's very, 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 very bad. Authentication services are helpful, right? So, if we think of things like Okta or whatever, everybody's using Okta today, right? So we can put Okta in front of these different services, and they'll secure the UI. So we can say, okay, well, I've got github.com, and so I'm just going to put Okta in front of it. Then I've got SSO and MFA, and and I'm super secure, and that's all well and good, right? Well, if you're operating these services in the cloud and they're not on-prem, well, that only secures the GUI, right? So again, you can just hit the API with that PAT. It's not going through your cloud router or any of this other stuff, right? You're going out to the open internet on that API and talking to that service. So authentication services are great, but you need to know that they have blind spots. That's my next point. API is accessible via the internet by default. Obviously, if you're running on-prem, you don't have these same problems, hopefully. And then we've also got inconsistent security standards across vendors, right? So there's no consistent ways that authentication's being implemented, and the API tokens are being managed, how you create users, how you maintain them, right? A lot of these, even if you're putting SAML or whatever in front of them, you can still create users directly in the system. You lose that visibility, and there's a whole host of other problems. So software factory, also not easy. Metrics drive adoption, however, no industry guidance. So this is another problem that's kind of common, with AppSec. I think I've talked here a couple of times about how hard metrics are and how most of the metrics we generate today just aren't valuable, right? If I went to my CISO and said we have 2,000 critical vulnerabilities, he's going to say, so what? What's that mean, right? What are you trying to communicate to me? Well, it's 1,000 more than we had last time. Okay. Did you get better at finding them? Did you create 1,000 more? Or, there's no story, there's no narrative, right? The numbers really don't mean anything valuable. I found no tooling to help with this. And there's no story to tell, right? So, we have to figure out what our story is, how we get those metrics, and then how we communicate that story through those metrics. And we'll talk about that more in a second. My last observation, this one might be a little more controversial. Supply chain security is not AppSec, right? It's similar. Thank you. And again, I think today, this is how we're implementing it, right? We're implementing it as part of an AppSec program, but it's a different skill set, it's different resources, and it's way more time intensive than just your AppSec program, right? Your AppSec resources cannot stretch so far to be able to do this as well. So in our organization, I kind of think of it as just two sides of the same coin, right? So my AppSec team is one side of the coin, and then the supply chain security team is really the other side. And then we work closely together on similar problems. But really, supply chain at the end of the day, right? You all saw the first slide. It's a lot more broad than AppSec, and it's definitely a whole lot less tactical. So the skill sets are similar, but AppSec is definitely more specialized. And actually had an interesting comment from my DevOps team earlier this week where they told me, hey, you know, like if and I got a typo there, so it should be SCS plus DevOps is equal to DevSecOps. I found that really interesting because I've spent about the last 7 years talking about how DevSecOps is really AppSec at speed and at scale. And so when the DevOps team said that to me, it's like, well, okay, that's one definition and it's not entirely wrong. So I thought that was pretty interesting. All right, lessons learned. So let's hopefully make this a bit more positive. So follow the path of least resistance, and that's not always shifting left. So let's go back to last year and talk about how much I hate shift left, right? But I think as AppSec professionals, we talk all of the time about shift left, right? We can't escape it. And, especially with the open source analysis, right? I think I kind of had all of these ideas that we talk about all of the time. Like, let's put Dependabot in there, and let's automatically create PRs, and the developers can just look at them and say, cool, I approve this, and like, we're done. Let's put the issues inside of GitHub so that they're right there, right? And, it's all these shift left things. And actually, our head of engineering actually pulled me aside and said, look, I get it. This is great. I understand what you're trying to do, and I appreciate it, but this sucks. And this is not how we operate, right? And in our case, it's we live and die inside of our our issue trackers and our Jiras and things like that. So if you really want to get traction and you want to get these things resolved, for us it might seem like we're living in GitHub and we can just click that button, but that's actually more work for us. So how about you send us tickets and then we'll prioritize accordingly, get that built into the sprints, and then the developers can, remediate, right? And it's all part of their normal development workflow that they're following today, right? So, and it's counterintuitive, I think, to a lot of things that we hear. But, the point is the developers already had a process. They have a way of working. And what we think is easy isn't always easy for them, right? So, build partnerships, work with your dev teams, understand how they work, and then fit into those workflows, right? As opposed to shifting left for the sake of shifting left, right? And that's, the next message here, right? Build partnerships, not enemies, right? When we come out and say, oh, this conference told me to shift left 1,000 times, we need to shift left, right? You're probably going to upset some people along the way, and you're going to make their lives harder. And then finally, strive for progress over perfection. And I've seen this in many, many organizations, right? We try to solve all the problem at once. We try to come up with the perfect solution. We roll it out. It's just not how it is, right? It's crawl, walk, run, right? Let's start somewhere, and then let's make incremental improvements until the end of time, right? Because we all know we're never going to be done. But let's not let that perfect end state prevent us from making progress today, right? Get out there and start, so that way we can continuously improve. So define what supply chain security means in your organization, right? Not all of you are going to agree with my definition, right? It fits our organization, great. It might not fit yours, right? And so, one of the challenges that I had was we had a lot of what I call gray area in there, right? Is it TPRM or is it supply chain? Right? If we need to look at this vendor and ask for a SOC 2 or something like that, who does that? Right? Is it TPRM? Is it GRC? Is it supply chain? I don't know. Well, when Log4j came out, right, it's really a code issue at the end of the day. So is that AppSec or is it supply chain security? There's just a lot of areas where if you're not careful, this can overlap with what your other teams are doing. And then you end up with multiple teams trying to solve the same problem, or you're stepping on each other's foot, or you eventually just say, nah, you go do it, I'm busy enough, right? So, your first time you draft this, you're probably gonna have a lot of gray area. That's okay. Understand it, talk about it, and when you run across those things, redefine your program a little bit, right? So that way you're removing that gray area as you go. You're not going to get it right the first time, right? This is new, right? Does anybody else in here have a supply chain security team? I hope so, but I doubt it. In a year, I haven't found another organization that does, and I'm actively looking for one, right? Because it's hard to figure all of this out. So I didn't get it right the first time. I'm about the 12th time now, and I still don't have it completely right. You're not going to either, right? This is all new. So, just understand that, your first time is not going to be perfect. Evaluate, your third parties and how you engage with them today. Go from there, right? Just pick somewhere to start. Is it security assessments? Is it looking at open source? Is it, pissing off half your company by telling them they can't use browser extensions anymore and then doing an approval process for each one of them, right? Just pick something and then grow from there, right? So, day one of my role, first thing I did was I went in and I created a wiki. And I basically said, this is, what I think supply chain security is. And then that became the foundation. And then again, it's a wiki, right? If I change my mind, I edit it, and then I communicate that out, and everybody's fine with that. So measure things, then improve them, right? So if you're doing something today, measure it. If you want to do something tomorrow, measure it, right? Start collecting that data, develop the trends, show what they are, and then work to improve them. Right? Do you have too many admins in one of your systems? Do you have repos that don't allow pull requests and people can just directly commit? I don't know, right? What's your total number of open source vulnerabilities? There's a lot of things that you can pick, right? Even if you're not necessarily tackling it today, start measuring it. So that way, when you do start initiatives to tackle those problems, you can show and demonstrate the project or the progress that you're making with those trends, right? So you're not going to, really what I'm saying is don't go solve problems and then develop metrics and then report them, right? Do the metrics today. Then go start solving the challenges and then, show the metrics, right? So maybe you see 3 months of, hey, you suck at everything, right? But let's go over collecting the data, right? So then we start tackling the problem. Hopefully, if we're tackling it right, we see the values come down or whatever direction we want it to go based on the story we're trying to tell. And then think about the story that you want to tell, right? Because it's probably not, I have so many open source vulnerabilities or something like that, right? It's, here's a really interesting attack chain of how, somebody could compromise our software factory. And then here's the different areas that we can build in security controls. And then here's how we're going to measure each one of them. So then that way, when this lands on, in my case, all the way to the CEO's desk, it's telling a story. And they can look at the numbers and they can extrapolate that story as opposed to numbers, right? They don't care about CVSS scores or red, amber, green or whatever, right? What's the story you're telling? If you start now, you'll be well ahead of most other companies, right? Again, I haven't found anybody else doing a supply chain security program yet, right? So if you go back and start one on Monday, you're well ahead of the curve, right? So this is getting back to industry analysts. The first call that I had with an industry analyst, they don't live in a forest, they work in a garden. You can kind of read between the lines there. They literally told me, you can spell SBOM. I have nothing to tell you here. You're well ahead of everyone else, right? That was literally a quote from an industry analyst talking about SBOMs. So there's not any best guidance out there, right? So, start now. You'll be well ahead of everyone else. We all know supply chain security is going to be critical, right? It's, again, 6 talks here, one of the most popular topics at RSA, and we know the executive order's coming. Let's be proactive. Let's start doing this. Let's figure out how to tackle this and be ahead of the curve. And there's really no barrier of entry, right? It's fair game, right? It's all greenfield. So, if you have an idea, step up, start tackling these problems, right? Talk to your third parties, do a security assessment, whatever it might be. So all we talk about is SBOMs. I think I've established now we can't even really do SBOMs, but there is a lot that you can do. So this is just some ideas on, where you can start today, right? So, if you want to take some ideas back and try to start rolling out a program, these are just a couple of things that you can do, right? Try to generate an SBOM. And then ask yourself, is this everything? Right? If somebody was to ask for a full SBOM of whatever your product might be, does that SBOM you created capture everything? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, right? If it doesn't, make it better, right? Pick a product, make a RACI, ask a supplier for their SBOM, and then figure out where the hell you're going to put it, because you're going to have some place to put it when they do actually give it to you. Talk to your suppliers, right? So again, when Log4j came out, I went out and we were a startup, right? So, we didn't necessarily have at that point in time, a full list of like, here's every supplier that we've partnered with, as we're in startup mode, right? So we kind of had to figure that out. And then, we went out to all of those suppliers and said, hey, there's this Log4j thing. Hopefully all of you have heard about it. Some had, some hadn't. Are you affected by it, right? Okay, cool. When are you going to patch? What's the impact? Where did you find it, right? And most of them were very a lot of them, it took them some time to get that to us, right? But they were open to the conversation and they had it with us. Measure how long it takes you to identify your open source packages, right? So again, Log4j took me 4 to 5 days. Apache Commons took me an hour, right? Getting back to metrics, that's a powerful narrative, right? That's demonstrating progress that we've made in a year. Understand your build and deploy process, right? Do you understand how your software factory works and how people are using it? I thought I did, but I surely didn't. And then prevent egress, internet access from your software factory. This one's hard, right? So, your developers, are they pulling open source packages from the internet, or do they go out to your artifact repo and get them? In a lot of cases, it probably comes internally, right? What about images? Are they going out to the internet and getting the, a latest image for a container? Or do you have Godin images that they have to use? Can you enforce that? Do the Docker files, go out, or GitHub runners or whatever, right? Do they source code from the internet? Right? We should probably cut all of that off and enforce getting all of that from one centralized place. And that's really hard to do. So real quick, because I know I'm out of time, what do I see as the future? Tooling, right? We have no tooling today. We need tooling. Somebody has to step up. They have to fill that space. Best practices. Again, we have none, right? So, somebody needs to step up and develop some standards and guidelines that we can use, which to the next point, CIS has actually put out a really, really good benchmark that I was really, really happy fairly aligns with the program that I put together. I think it's behind, I didn't put the link because I think it's behind a paywall or something weird because it's CIS, but they do have a benchmark for supply chain security that you can use today to go out and kind of manage and help you build a program. We need hardening guidelines, right? We need supplier adoption. We can talk about SBOMs and things all day long, but until our vendors and suppliers start giving them to us, it's kind of meaningless. So, we need them to support this just as well as we need to support it. We need SBOMs everywhere and from everything, right? And we need tooling to generate them, and we need to make sure that they're generated according to the specifications. I've thought a lot about, can I use SBOMs to replace my software composition analysis? So if I've got an accurate SBOM for all of my packages, right? Do I really need software composition analysis sitting out there scanning my package managers and then giving me a list of vulnerabilities? Well, if it's faster and easier for me to generate an SBOM and then map those packages to vulnerabilities, well, why the hell wouldn't I just do that, right? And if I was some of these composition analysis vendors, I would be scared of this because, once those vendors, the SBOM vendors, the couple there are, actually put out a tool to generate the SBOM for you instead of you figuring out that part, well, we don't really have as much need for software composition analysis other than we could argue maybe in a pipeline. And then obviously we have the executive order, right? So hopefully that will drive adoption, but we're seeing very little of that today. So in conclusion, SBOMs are the conversation starter, but they're not the end game, right? To Dan's point, they're really the bare minimum, and they're really, really, really challenging. Building this in your AppSec program might be a good place to start. But once you really start looking at all of your supply chain, it gets much bigger and broader than AppSec really quick. So that's it. I don't think we have time for questions, but if you have any, feel free to come grab me. Thank you very much.